One of the drivers of inconsistent power in rural areas in South Africa was that during the apartheid era, electricity was prioritized for urban white areas. So the extremities of the grid happened to fall into rural black populations. So the vaccine fridges were not vaccine refrigerators, they were fridges you find in your kitchen. For the camping and off-grid exploring, there's companies that make fridges which run on very low power. These same companies use that technology to make vaccine refrigerators. So you could now have reliable knowledge that your vaccines were kept at the manufacturer's specified temperature. The impact on children being vaccinated was huge.
Welcome to the Pioneers of Possibility podcast. I'm your host, Kareem Afzal. And for those of you on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you're getting the podcast, I ask that you please subscribe, follow the show, and please leave a comment so we get some feedback as to how to improve the show and types of guests you would like to see. This week, I'm really thrilled to be able to welcome Dr. Sakib Khan, CEO of Interlake. Welcome to the show, Doctor.
No, thank you very much. I'm honored to be here and looking forward to our chat.
So, Sakib, please tell me, what does Interlake do?
So I established Interlake back in the late 2000s, really to address a need that there wasn't really a pure play hydrogen economy consultancy here in South Africa. So that was the real need, but it actually then sort of transformed into a consultancy which looked at groundbreaking technologies, fuel cells, electrolyzers, etc., and how they could bridge the gap to solving real problems, which, in South Africa, energy access, water access, etc., and then sort of also dovetailed into strategy, government policy, etc. So really proud of the work that we've been doing, and there's a lot more work to be done.
You know, a lot of our guests here have really fascinating family backgrounds, and many of their backgrounds are migratory stories.
Yes.
And your family's background and your background is a very fascinating and inspiring one for our guests. So please share a bit about, your family background and that story.
Sure. So my family, my immediate parents, my grandparents were all born and raised in East Africa, in Kenya. Many people ask me, well, how did Indians end up in Kenya? During the sort of late 1900s, the British, they had their colony in Kenya, Uganda, and sort of British East Africa. The Germans had German East Africa. And there was a race between the two powers to build a railroad that went from the coast to the interior. And that was essentially to move ivory, other raw materials, etc., to the coast for the colonial powers, own needs. And the British, in constructing the railroad from Mombasa, Nairobi, going through to the interior in Uganda, they brought over primarily North Indians from India to act as laborers, as administrators, etc., in the colony. The Germans, on the other hand, used Germans to actually build the railroads. So this planted the sort of the seeds of the first Indian communities in East Africa. As an interesting side note, during that time, the interior of Africa was actually quite wild. And the wild animals, the predators, hadn't really come across people in the numbers they came across as the railroad started to move into the interior. And you may have heard the story of the two man-eating lions from East Africa who started to prey on the Indian workers. They were called The Ghost and the Darkness, and there was a Hollywood movie, I believe, in the 2000s, which actually dramatized the story of those man-eaters. So the Indian communities then, after the railroads were built, they settled, many of them. I believe, and I stand to be corrected, that 70 to 80,000 Indians were brought over. Many then returned back to the subcontinent. And a small nucleus of Indians remained. And that was, obviously part of my heritage. My grandfather then worked within the British colonial government. He later was awarded the MBA medal, the member of the British Empire, for his services to the British Post Office. During independence, then in the early 60s, and post-independence, many of the Indians then moved to the UK, and my parents were part of that first migration to the UK.
Independence of Kenya.
From Kenya, yes.
From Kenya, okay, yes.
Yes, they moved then, and also from Uganda, Tanzania, and others. The contrast now, moving from East Africa, where they had a certain life, moving now to the UK, it was very cold. They were the first sort of wave of immigrants. There was a level of racism, at that time towards migrants coming from Africa, the subcontinent, the West Indies, etc. And I think the intention back there was many of the immigrants would fulfill the jobs that many of the British people did not want to do at the time, and then return back to their homelands after that. My parents remained. And I think it was through those tough times that the character was developed, this survival instinct, where communities came together, where life was actually very hard. And then I was born in the early 70s, and England was the only life and culture I knew, apart from obviously the home culture of our ancestors. My parents also made a conscious decision not to move to an area of the UK where there were a lot of immigrants. They actually moved to an area which was very white. And they had to ask permission of the neighbors to buy a house if they would be accepted into that sort of community. This is how the UK was.
This was a law.
Not
was
a
a law, or it
was
was good manners, so to speak?
Yes, because you're an immigrant family moving to a very white area. You asked the neighbors, "Is it okay for us to live here?" And so my brother and I sort of grew up in a very British town. We were the first of our generation of immigrants at the nursery school, the primary school, etc. And truth be told, we didn't really experience any racism. We grew up with our neighbors, our classmates, and our parents, like traditional Indian parents, really hid a lot of the struggles from us. As we grew up, it was only as we got older we realized, there were times when things were very hard. The interest rates in the 80s were very high. They were struggling to pay mortgage. When we were demanding our first computers, etc., toys, they always sort of made a plan. And it was very much shielded from us, the struggles they went through. And I think that sort of also helped in a way of, later understanding the hardships, building the characters, which my brother and I then, sort of built, and then understanding the sacrifices which were made.
That's really a great story. So you then went on to your college, university education, and you did a PhD with a concentration on fuel cells. So firstly, explain what a fuel cell is for our guests. And then why did you decide that? Because that's a very kind of quote unquote early stage of the technology for the development of this type of product. So walk us through that.
Well, I'd like to think there was a plan to everything, but sometimes how opportunities come up and and present themselves. My first degree was chemistry. And when I completed that degree, I then had an opportunity to study for a PhD. And I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do my PhD in. And I was a member of the Royal Society of Chemistry, like many of my peers were during our university times. And there was a journal that used to come out every month from the Royal Society of Chemistry. And obviously, there were various topics covered in that. And there was always a section at the back which advertised positions for PhDs. And I saw one, and it was for fuel cells. I didn't know what a fuel cell was. And I then, did a bit of research. And now this is really the days before, there was the internet, but not the rich information that was available. And one had to walk over to the library to look up books and stuff. And I did a bit of research, and I thought, this sounds very interesting. The magnitude of the impact, which I'll come to in a moment, of what a fuel cell could achieve didn't really dawn on me, but the technology just seemed very interesting. So for the listeners, a fuel cell generates electricity, and it does that by taking hydrogen as a fuel. But unlike your car engine or diesel generator, it doesn't burn the fuel. It has a very clever chemical process which turns the hydrogen into electricity very efficiently, and the byproduct in many cases is only pure water. And what's fascinating about that is it does it at a very high efficiency. And what's very interesting about hydrogen is an energy carrier. So it can be derived from many different sources. So for example, many people who did science at school probably did the experiment where they took a beaker of water, they passed electricity maybe through 2 paper clips into it, and on one of the paper clips you saw bubbles of hydrogen, on the other bubbles of oxygen. And at an industrial scale, that's called an electrolyzer. And so one can pass solar power, wind power, traditional generated power from coal into an electrolyzer with water and generate hydrogen. And that can then go into a fuel cell to generate electricity. So my PhD at the time was sponsored by British Gas. And British Gas were looking at using solid oxide fuel cells, a different flavor. There's many flavors of fuel cells. We're using this particular flavor of fuel cell to actually take natural gas from pipelines, like in the UK, everyone cooks on gas, heats water on gas, central heating. Take this and turn that into hydrogen and then electricity. And moreover, I didn't do a traditional scientific PhD in a lab. My PhD was using, at that time, cutting-edge, high-performance computational chemistry to actually study what happens in the materials of the fuel cell. Now, thinking back, that computing power, those supercomputers at the time, are probably less powerful than what iPhone is now. But that in itself was fairly cutting edge to do that. And there were no fancy graphics. Everything was done building numerical data centers, data sets, sending them to the supercomputer, hoping you didn't make an error, full stop in the wrong place or something. And the allotted time that you had on that supercomputer was enough then to run your job and send back the answers, which were then sort of loaded into graphical software to plot what was happening. So cutting edge on 2 fronts, computational methods which were evolving and fuel cells in themselves, which at the time were not very fashionable like they are today, but were an emerging technology.
I think it's important for our listeners to also understand that fuel cells go way back to the space program, the early space program in the 60s, where they used fuel cells in the moon landing. They used fuel cells for most of the rockets that went up into space and in orbit. So fuel cells have very long history in advancing human achievement and launching into the stars and in the moon program. You have a very interesting place where you use fuel cells, but I want to get to you decided to go from the UK and you decided to make your permanent home in Africa.
Yes.
So tell us about this decision and journey, and how you ended up in Africa in your
Yes.
early career.
Yeah. To answer that question, one also has to take a step back to the 1980s. So, as I mentioned, born and raised in the UK of East African parents. And obviously, there was still a lot of families still in East Africa. And so we would visit on a regular basis, for summer holidays, etc., visit grandparents. Then there were some terrible events that took place in Kenya, the 1st of August 1982, where the military and the Air Force took over the government while the president was out of the country. And the Indians were actually targets of that, as were some of the whites. The Indians were seen to, the Indians did have a lot of significant business interests. A lot of the shops were Indian owned, etc. The farms were owned by sort of British settlers who had remained after independence. So this was a sort of a rallying cry of this military coup, that they wanted to maybe distribute the wealth, more evenly, etc. And unfortunately, during that time, when I was 10 years old, we were actually there. We saw some of the horrific events that took place during that time directly with our family. Many of the family members, my mother, my grandfather, my auntie, my grandmother, were beaten, etc. And it was a horrific, time. So a lot of the family after that sort of left, Kenya, and the family was sort of spread in the UK, Pakistan, North America, particularly around the Chicagoland area. And I, like many of my family members, we're still African, at our core. Once you've experienced Africa, it's very difficult to take that out of your blood, even though you've made a life in other parts of the world. So when I finished my PhD in the UK, 3 universities in the UK during the South African apartheid era, and this was, for the listeners who may not know, South Africa had quite a repressive white rule, which went on all the way until 1994, which limited what people of color could do, their movement, etc. So during that apartheid era, many black researchers from South Africa were studying in the University of Bath, Sussex, and Surrey. So when I finished my PhD in 1998, I had the opportunity to then come and teach in South Africa at a research group. And that was my first time in South Africa, but it was Africa. And I highly enjoyed my time teaching at a black, historically disadvantaged university. I then went back to the UK, joined a small startup company, US startup company in Cambridge. And then I ended up back developing business in Africa. And then I stayed in Africa. I trained as a pilot during that time as well.
Pilot, like flying a plane. Okay.
Planes, yes. And then I settled in South Africa. And I then had an opportunity to join a British fuel cell company who then wanted to look at South Africa and Africa as a market. And so I set up their business here in South Africa. And during that time, did some actually quite exciting work. We deployed the first fuel cells in rural applications, in rural healthcare, water monitoring. So these types of application had a direct impact on the rural poor. And that was one of the reasons why I also wanted to settle in South Africa was, as I mentioned in my introduction to ENELAC, was to have that bridge of technology and real world applications of the technology, not just installing something, even though all technology has a real world application, but the impact here in South Africa was greater because, for example, one of the projects was a vaccine refrigerator. So this one was very close to my heart because in rural Africa, there are many frontline clinics which don't necessarily have full-time doctors, but they have sisters and nurses who can handle a broken arm, the first care for that, or childhood diseases, etc. And vaccination is a very important part of that because a lot of these childhood diseases through vaccination are highly preventable, but they require vaccines which have been kept at the right temperature, have not expired, and can be given to children at the right time. However,
and I think one of the challenges for our listeners that I think is very important to understand is that not just in rural areas, but even major cities, there is a load shedding issue where there's not enough power capacity to keep power on even 80% of the day in some of these areas. So this is where this technology that you helped introduce into these rural areas was help buffer that inconsistency of power.
Yes. So that was a very important part. And one of the drivers of inconsistent power in rural areas in South Africa was that during the apartheid era, electricity was prioritized for urban white areas. So the extremities of the grid happened to fall into rural black populations. So the investment had not really taken place. And even when, after independence, it still took a long time for the grid then to be extended and strengthened into rural areas. So what tends to happen, and was happening, was one, the vaccine fridges were not vaccine refrigerators, they were fridges you find in your kitchen, which you cannot control the temperature of. And secondly, as you mentioned, when the power went down, the vaccines obviously would start to heat up. And the only recourse was for the nurses to take the vaccines out and put them into ice boxes with ice, which meant the vaccines would freeze. So the solution that we derived was for the camping and off-grid exploring. There's companies that make fridges which run on very low power that you could put in the back of your pickup, etc., when you go on safari. And these same companies use that technology to make vaccine refrigerators, which required less than 100 watts of power. And the temperature
a light bulb, right? So a very high-powered incandescent light bulb.
Yeah, correct.
Yeah.
And you could control the temperature to 1 decimal place. So if you needed 4.5 degrees, you could do that. The walls were very thick because they were insulated. So when there was not power, you could maintain at least the temperature within a certain range. So we installed a 100-watt fuel cell powered by hydrogen cylinders connected to the grid as well. So when the fuel cell sensed the grid went down, immediately, being a hydrogen fuel cell, it immediately provided power. So you could now have reliable knowledge that your vaccines were kept at the manufacturer's specified temperature, and we never really quantified it, but the impact on children being vaccinated was huge. So that was one example of taking a very high-tech technology, applying it to where there was impact, real impact, And the other example was in rural communities, water is scarce and it has to be managed. And the local municipalities have these sort of water balancing dams where high up there is one dam and then they control by opening valves to the next dam, etc., to manage. These have little remote monitoring radios that transmit back to the municipality to say what the water level is at, etc., etc. One of the challenges, again, is if there's no power, you can't effectively manage the water. So again, we had 100-watt fuel cells installed, which then provided reliable power to ensure that the water could be managed in those communities.
This really is a prime example of marrying locally used kind of low-tech technologies, right? So your
Yes.
Sort of freezer, refrigerator, so to speak, for folks who go out into the bush, and high tech, marrying those two to really satisfy a local need. You know, one of
Yes.
my big beliefs, and as I go through this innovation series here on the podcast, is that there's not a silver bullet for any particular economy. No silver bullet for Africa. It's going to look very different than Indonesia, very different than India. It's these local solutions to local challenges that use part of these high-tech solutions that really enable this, not just growth of the industry, but solutions to real challenges that people are facing. And that's, it would be a very interesting and I think valuable metric to understand how many people got vaccinated.
Yes.
For example, through that period that technology was used.
Yes.
To be able to say, maybe we should put this in other remote areas of Africa as well.
Yeah. And I think, again, sort of linking my story, I had a passion for the technology. If I had remained in the UK, but still wanted, I wanted to do something which impacted directly on people's lives, I could have still researched fuel cells, made fuel cells in the UK. But the missing part is, if you want to solve problems, you've almost got to live and understand the problems. Because the problem isn't just the vaccine was not available because it had thawed, etc. You then have to understand, you could put the solution in, but then you have to understand, well, the nurses would have to manage this system. And this was before the time of really the Internet of Things, remote monitoring wasn't as readily available. So we provided a Nokia cell phone that has SMS capability. We trained the local nurses to just look at the display on the fuel cell, SMS me what they were seeing. In terms of safety, hydrogen burns without a flame, so you can't, a visible flame, so you can't see what's going on. We kept a broom near the hydrogen cylinders, and if they felt there was something off, they would look with the, feel with the broom near the hydrogen cylinders, and if the broom caught fire, they knew to call, So one has to sort of almost understand the environment, and you've almost got to live in the environment to understand the culture, the environment. One of the things we discovered was, because the fuel cell stack, and that is like the heart of the system, is warm and moist, it attracted African wasps, which are, about sort of 5 centimeters, maybe, I don't know, inches, an inch and a half, or in size. And what an African wasp does is it builds a nest out of mud. It picks up small bits of mud and continuously over weeks goes and makes this sort of nest, and it's like concrete. The fuel cell stack was the ideal environment. So they had got into the fuel cell and started to make their nest on the stack. Through that learning, we realized you've got to actually have a totally complete closed system, etc., etc. So there were all these sort of things which, again, you would only realize by deploying and being in the environment what you had to manufacture elsewhere to protect against.
So you brought this high technology into a region that is not used, probably used to very low tech sort of solutions for their challenges. How was the users of, the people who are taking the vaccines out of the refrigerator, the people who you were asking to take the broom, how was their reception to using this?
It was extremely positive because you were solving a very important problem. And secondary to that, it was a fuel cell, it had hydrogen, etc. There was enthusiasm and there was this willingness to learn, because the end result could mean life or death.
More kids get vaccinated, right?
Exactly. That's right. Yeah. And it was just amazing. It was, people wanted to find solutions. They wanted to participate. And seeing the smiles on people's faces, and I think part of it also was these were deep rural communities. And and the feeling was you're paying attention. It's not like a bureaucracy that may be sitting, 1,000 kilometers away, trying to maybe sort out a problem. Here were people, and we were very honored. It was our privilege to be doing it. But I think there was this sort of feeling of, someone is paying attention to this problem.
Our human spirit wants to be heard. So
Yes.
wherever you are, you're in a big city or in the middle of nowhere, trying to support our fellow human beings. And when people see and understand that you're providing a real solution to the problem to help them live their daily lives better and to help those grow and hopefully be educated and sort of grow up to be productive, happy, healthy humans, then they're very receptive to it. I guess we'll get into bureaucracy now. So you were commissioned and you were one of the co-authors to South Africa's hydrogen strategy. How did you get pulled into this? And tell us a bit about that experience.
As I mentioned, 2002 was when, via this UK fuel cell company, we started to do some of this excellent work. And fuel cells were relatively new to South Africa. I remember being visited at my office by a government official, and she said to me, Dr. Khan, you have fuel cells, and for your listeners, fuel cells use critical minerals, particularly platinum, and South Africa is the world's largest producer of platinum. But as a country, we mine the platinum, we turn it into a bar, we sell it all over the world, and elsewhere, companies turn that platinum into other products. And one of those is a catalyst, which is required for the fuel cell. And then South Africa needs to then buy back whatever platinum products at multiples of the price that the original platinum was sold. So there's no value add happening in South Africa. And we have a term in South Africa, we call that beneficiation. So this lady from one of the government departments said, fuel cells use platinum. We need to, as a country, do something in fuel cells and add value to the platinum by creating an industry in South Africa which can value add the platinum into fuel cells, electrolyzers, and other technology. And so from that moment, I was part of the core planning team, which then held workshops, etc., with stakeholders from government, academia, industry, various parts of the value chain. And that culminated in the first hydrogen and fuel cell strategy, which was then predicated on the fact that South Africa has platinum. We should be then developing fuel cell and electrolyzer technologies. And that was then ratified by government in 2007. I then went on to help establish various competence centers in the country at academic institutions, government-owned research institutions, which would look at various parts of the value chain. And I was privileged to be part of the team that went to China, to Shanghai, where the IPHE, the International Partnership for Hydrogen in the Economy, then we went to motivate why South Africa should join the IPHE with the foundation of our strategy, which we developed, and we were then accepted into the IPHE as a country. So that was, a big team effort. There were many of us involved, in that. But it's one of the activities which I look back on with pride, because that then led on to the country getting much more involved in hydrogen, et cetera, et cetera.
So when people think about working in government, they think about inefficiencies and government moves very slow. But I'd like you to just share what do you think is your biggest takeaway from the process, right? What is the biggest thing that you learned about yourself and the process out of working on that?
What was very interesting was I had to work with so many different types of stakeholders. So academics, industry, international experts, and government. And what I learned about government as well is that governments around the world are very similar in that there is a lot of bureaucracy, but there's a lot of people in government who are very passionate about whatever their portfolio may be. And in this case, it was beneficiation, technology, hydrogen fuel cells. And it was a real pleasure as well working with such motivated people. The whole process was not without its frustrations. When one has to take on board the opinions of a multitude of different stakeholders and almost diplomatically hear all the opinions, discuss them, sometimes challenge them, but then ultimately bring them together for one goal, to move the country forward in this area. And I think that probably was one of the biggest takeaways in the whole process, and probably one of the best learning experiences and general experiences, because you're not only dealing with people who are experts in their field or industry, you're dealing with personalities, as well, different backgrounds. And more so in South Africa, I mean, for your listeners, they may not know, there's 11 official languages in South Africa. There's a multitude of different tribes. There's even within the white tribe, there's English speakers and Afrikaans speakers who have a very pained history between themselves. And then your listeners may not know, the biggest Indian community outside of India is in South Africa, in Durban. Yeah. So now you have different cultural melting points, all South Africans, but coming from so many, and having to listen and having to bring opinions together. It was a fascinating experience.
My general experience is I've traveled the world and worked with governments and public servants in different parts of the world to advance hydrogen and the hydrogen work around the world is, ultimately people go into public service for the betterment of their society. Then things may change and stay in it because of their love of power or whatever. But I would say 90% really go into it for the public good. Outside of your professional career, you have taken up a love of running. So tell me a bit about how that came about.
Well, I think in part, I mean, we've known each other for a while, and I know you're quite a fond runner as well. And listening to some of your stories, about running, I took up running probably, in 2024 around September. And really, it was more of a bit of a challenge sort of to myself to go and do something that was outside the gym. South Africa is a beautiful country. Our weather is fantastic. The people are amazing. And just being in those outdoor spaces, that has been phenomenal. What I did not expect from my running journey was the massive positive impact on mental health. That you cannot underestimate that. As I said, I started running September 2024. I did my first organized half marathon in April 2025. And the achievement that one gets from those sort of events. But ultimately, to me, running has been a solo. It's something I do by myself, for myself, to get clarity, to be outdoors, and it's been a phenomenal journey. I know. I mean, we chat about running. I know. I mean, I have a long way to go to reach.
Everybody's journey is their own.
But I enjoyed our run in Cape Town when we ran up to Signal Hill. That was a 350-meter elevation gain. Totally uphill
in a very short amount of distance.
Yes,
so, tough run.
So
That's great.
Really,
the solidarity, the solitude of it.
Yes.
Where it's just you and the rhythm of your footfalls and your breath.
Yes.
I find the best thinking, and I think you express that.
That's exactly, yes.
You can get when you're just alone, and that rhythm of the breath is almost like a metronome.
Yes, correct.
That your mind goes blank.
Yes.
And then you could get an amazing clarity about very complex issues.
Exactly.
And you come back and something that you've been struggling with for months is going to crystal clarity. We talked about local solutions to climate change. So I'm talking broadly on climate change. What do you see as the brightest opportunities to fight climate change in Southern Africa?
I think one of the opportunities for climate change or positive affecting climate change, two things, sorry. One is that we as a continent can leapfrog incumbent technologies, right? Coal-fired, centralized generation. We can move very quickly to distributed energy. And this sort of fast tracks the positive effect on climate. Why? Because you can have distributed solar, wind, hydrogen, fuel cells, etc. There's a big drive, particularly in South Africa, towards hydrogen. We're seeing it now, the discussions we had spilling into the motive applications as well. And there is something we call the just energy transition. And this is why it's exciting. Because so many people are without reliable electricity, water, etc., and these are priorities for our governments on the continent. In order to address them, we can immediately look at solar, wind, hydrogen, etc., and that then accelerates climate change, fighting, resilience, and technologies.
That's really amazing. So, final question: what would be the single takeaway you would pass on to our listeners from your experience that's enabled your success?
Yes, I will answer it via a quote from Nelson Mandela, that it only seems impossible until it's done. And you and I have been in the hydrogen economy for decades. Sometimes it's frustrating, sometimes it's slow, but the impossible is turning into the possible. And we just need to carry that single vision of making people's lives better. Doesn't matter what the periphery is. Focus on that, and then everything else starts to fall in place.
Well, Dr. Sakib, making lives better in Africa through big visionary work and purpose. So I want to thank you very much for joining the show, and look forward to catching up on a run, Cape Town or where else we see each other.
Thank you very much, and it's been my honor.
This episode of The Pioneers of Possibility has been produced and edited by Danny Vagnoni, with music credits going to the artist known as Sahari, and artwork for our podcast is presented by the artist known as Layla. I'm your host, Kareem Afzal. Thank you for listening. If you like this episode and you would like to hear more from future episodes, please follow us on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. and click the subscribe button on YouTube. And please leave a comment so we can engage our listeners. Thank you very much. See you next time.